Good morning. I sure miss you guys. This morning I've got about 11 or 12 slides on William Cullen Bryant. It's no surprise that William Cullen Bryant was influenced by the British Romantic poets. Most poets of his generation would have been. Most notably, the English Romantic poet William Wordsworth was an extraordinary influence to the poetry of William Cullen Bryant. Wordsworth celebrated the majesty of nature, and we know that this is a key characteristic of American Romanticism. Wordsworth also celebrated the commonplace and used a very straightforward and accessible language or diction in his poetry. Bryant wrote the first draft of Thanatopsis, his most famous poem, in 1813 and 1814, which is a pretty deep poem for a teenager. I think he would have been about 18 at this time. Pretty deep subject matter and treatment of death. So the title of the poem is really a merging of two Greek words, and Bryant would have been fluent in Latin and Greek with his education. The Greek word thanatos meaning death and opsis meaning view or sight. So the poem really is an extended meditation on death. It's hard to make money as a poet, and so William Cullen Bryant worked as a lawyer, as did many of his contemporary poets, for whom poetry was an avocation and not necessarily a vocation. Oliver Wendell Holmes, as you may remember, was an extraordinarily competent and very well-known physician. Bryant went on to hold several different posts in magazine publishing, the New York Review, and then editor-in-chief at the Evening Post. When he was in the sunset of his years, he did complete translations of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. As we read through these poems by William Cullen Bryant, you will see how he is considered to be right in the mainstream of the early American Romantic movement. Because in these poems, you'll see that he does several things routinely. You will see him often finding inspiration in the American wilderness, in its landscape. Um, you will see him celebrate things that are um, uniquely American. And so he is celebrating this new nation. And this is this third point. He, along with so many of his contemporaries, called on American artists to establish an American identity and to become culturally independent from Europe. We had declared ourselves politically independent from Great Britain, but we were still very much dependent culturally on our European and English ancestry. And so it's this generation of writers who begins looking around and saying, enough of this, and let's try to do something that is truly as unique and as original and as organic as this brand new country. Critics or detractors of William Cullen Bryant's poetry will often cite the fact that he was still very much in his poetry writing in a neoclassical form. In other words, he's still writing in traditional forms, traditional meters, and traditional rhyme schemes. And so, even though his content and his themes are often those that celebrate things that are American, the poems themselves as entities, as printed pieces of text on the page, still look very much like English poems and European poems. So the criticism being that his poetry is still too restrained, too conventional. And this is perhaps surprising since he and Walt Whitman were great friends. And we'll talk about Whitman more. in the slides and days and weeks ahead. Here's an early picture of Walt Whitman, probably about 1855 or so, and his one of his quotes on the poetry and the work of William Cullen Bryant. He's referring to William Cullen Bryant, belonged to the classics, like the stately measures prescribed by the old formulas, which Bryant handled marvelously well. His contribution was not novel, it was nature's song, philosophy of a rather formal cast. End quote. So maybe Bryant did fail to consider that his neoclassic insistence on a set of fixed poetic forms and conventions, rhyme and meter and stanzaic structure, etc., ran contrary or was inconsistent with the huge and wild landscape of the America that he celebrated and the America that he tried to establish as a cultural identity. It would be Whitman, though, whose poetry sets out and successfully captures the true wilderness, expansiveness, and the greatness of America. Whitman is known for his long, bold, innovative, original lines of poetry. All you have to do is open up Song of Myself if you don't believe me. When Whitman publishes Leaves of Grass in 1855, people don't know what the hell to make of it, because simply put, nothing had ever been presented in verse like the poetry of Walt Whitman. Look, I know some of you know what's up and some of you are hip. And let me just say this, if you don't know who Marvin Gaye is, then you don't know what's up, or you don't, and you're not hip. So uh, one thing you might want to do is go ahead to go to YouTube and listen to Marvin Gaye's song, What's Going On, because to me it is gives us a nice way into considering poetry, because something is always going on in a poem. Always some purpose of the poet is revealed, often through tension, often through figurative language, but nobody just sits down to write a poem for the sake of writing a poem. And if we're smart, and if we take the time, and if we pay close attention, we can learn from poems as we can from all great art. I've provided a link to a YouTube video of someone reading William Cullen Bryant's poem Thanatopsis. As you listen to it and read along in your book, remember that the early 19th century, when this poem is written, was an era when landscape painting favored a vast canvas, these sweeping panoramic scenes depicting the wild, dark, windswept landscapes of the American frontiers and prairies and mountains, period. If you will, open up your textbook and you can see the colored pictures in your textbook, the colored plate pictures. The one by Asher Durant, two figures on the rock in the middle distance are Bryant and the American romantic painter Thomas Cole. We'll talk about Thomas Cole in a minute. Cole founded the Hudson River School of Painters, and they were a group of artists who, like the poets of the period, were drawing their inspiration from the American landscape and wilderness. So as you read and listen to Thanatopsis, read and listen to it as though it were a visual experience. Where do you see these painterly moments in the poem? In a sense, we see Bryant creating truly a landscape painting with words. Cullen Bryant's Thanatopsis is an elegy, which is a poem that typically laments or grieves for the dead and offers a reflection on the death of a prominent person or a loved one. And if you have read other elegies, you know that the conventions of the elegy as a poem, as a form, require it ultimately to move from a state of grief into the state of consolation. In other words, as we read through the poem, we begin in darkness and we move away from the pain. Bryant gives us an elegy for all of mankind and for all living things, because all humanity and all living things ultimately must die. At times, the poem almost sounds like a soliloquy. A soliloquy is an extended speech from an actor, and the most famous examples would come from the Shakespearean catalog of tragic heroes and tragic protagonists like a Hamlet or a Macbeth or an Othello, off by himself or herself and thinking aloud about the human condition and the state of his or her soul at a particular moment. So as you read through the lines, you can ask yourself, what lines in this elegy, in this poem, strike you as sounding especially Shakespearean in tone? Now, questions 2 and 3 are ultimately questions I'm going to ask you to consider and respond to in our next quiz, or quiz 10 period. I'm going to ask you to choose either 2 or 3 and write a written response. How does this poem find its way out of melancholy? Is it done by logic? Does the speaker come through this transition by relying on his intuition? And try to locate where in the poem the mood changes and how it changes, because it does. So read through the lines carefully and try to mark that place in the text where you think, okay, here we seem to be moving away from grief and perhaps into consolation, out of the darkness and toward some type of reconciliation with things. Or you might choose to write on question 3, what is missing in this poem that purports to be a meditation on death? I don't want to give it away, but I want you to think about that and think about what we have come to know about our ancestors and the type of poetry they wrote. I'm thinking here about back to the Puritans, and then the Enlightenment, and now the Romantics. So here's a poem that's about death and meditates on it. But what is missing in this poem? There's something, and it's big. We mentioned Thomas Cole, the landscape painter, famous for helping found the Hudson River School of landscape painting a few slides ago. Thomas Cole and William Cullen Bryant were fabulous friends, and so in this poem, to Cole, the painter departing for Europe, William Cullen Bryant, in his title, gives us the circumstances and the situation that inspired the poem. Listen, I tried to find online a good video or on YouTube a recording of this poem being read, and my God, they were just awful. I mean, they seriously were lame. So you're going to have Dr. Calatrello read it to you. I've got it here on the slide for you. You can read it here. You can read it out of your book. But this is To Cole the Painter, departing for Europe. Thine eyes shall see the lights of distant skies. Yet, Cole, thy heart shall bear to Europe's strand a living image of our own bright land, such as upon thy glorious canvas lies. Lone lakes, savannas where the bison roves, rocks rich with summer garlands, solemn streams, skies where the desert eagle wheels and screams, spring bloom and autumn blaze of boundless groves. Fair scenes shall greet thee where thou goest, fair but different everywhere the trace of men, paths, homes, graves, ruins, from the lowest glen to where life shrinks from the fierce alpine air. Gaze on them until the tears shall dim thy sight, but keep that earlier, wilder image bright. This is an Italian sonnet. And again, an Italian sonnet is sometimes called a Petrarchan sonnet, named after the Italian poet Petrarch, who popularized the form. It is one made up of an octave. If we look at the first 8 lines of the poem that rhyme A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A, and it should be a sestet. This is a typographical error. I apologize. It should be SESTET, the last 6 lines. That rhymes CDD, CEE. You might remember this Petrarchan sonnet form from when we looked at Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Cross of Snow. Do you remember that? It's the exact same kind of poem. An octave, a sestet, has 14 lines, a very particular fixed form and rhyme scheme. The octave sets up a problem. Then there's the volta. Do you remember that? VOLTA. The volta is sort of an imaginary rhetorical line between the 8th and the 9th line, where the poem pivots, where we move from a problem to a solution, or from a question to an answer. So I want you to think about the conflict that is expressed by the speaker in this poem. Remember, think about Marvin Gaye. What's going on in this poem, right? So you've got William Cullen Bryant and Thomas Cole, good buddies, both American or living in America and writing about and using America as their primary source of inspiration. And so here's William Cullen Bryant writing this poem to Thomas Cole, who's going to Europe to do some painting. Okay? So think about that. What possible conflict is there in that? Again, consider the first 8 lines as sort of the setup or the situation for this poem, and then the last 6 as a response to it. So in the first 8 lines, we see the speaker talking about the type of painting that Cole has done, right? And they're decidedly American things, these lakes and savannas where the bison, the buffalo rove, right? These wild open skies where the eagles are flying about, the spring blooms, the autumn blazes of boundless groves. These are the images that Cole captures and renders so majestically in his painting, right? So now, look at the last 6 lines. He says that fair scenes will greet you where you're going. In other words, when you get to Europe. And he says they'll be fair ones, but they're going to be different, aren't they? Europe's different than America. And everywhere you go in Europe, he's saying, you will see artifacts and traces of civilization, the fingerprint of man and humanity, right? Pathways, homes, graves, ruins. Think about it. Cathedrals, churches, architecture, fountains. Think about the centuries and centuries of human Western civilization in Europe and England. He says you're going to see all of these things wherever you go because there's such a history there of civilization. He says you're going to see all of these things from the lowest glen, which is like a valley, to the very highest part of where man lives, near the alpine regions. He says in the last 2 lines, though, he says, look at them. In other words, you're going to be there and you're going to be inspired by them. You're going to want to paint them, in other words, right? Because Cole's a painter. That's what painters do. They paint. He says, gaze on them, look at them, paint them. He says, until your tears will dim your sight. But look at that last line. This is where the answer is given. The answer to the question, where do you see the landscape that Bryant prefers suggested? Here in the last line. But keep that earlier, wilder image bright. See, that's it. He says, don't forget. Don't forget where you came from. Don't forget about the vastness, the wilderness, the frontier, the mountains, the Hudson River, the prairies, everything that is still so wild and unspoiled in America. Damn good poem. Inscription for the Entrance to a Wood. A long poem, one that might at first seem to be intimidating or difficult to process or to interpret and understand. I'm not going to read it in the interest of bandwidth. I'm having trouble uploading some of these videos where I am right now. But as you read through this poem, I want you to keep these uh, points in mind, okay? As is the case with so many of the Romantic poets, and Bryant is no exception. This poem celebrates the healing properties and the healing powers, literally the recreational powers of nature. The speaker will remind us that civilized life, those of when we're in the city, when we're in society, when we're in our towns, and so forth, civilized life for the Romantic is one that is marked by guilt, by misery, so much so that it can create for us a sick heart. Nature, though, if we look closely, is full of life, it's full of beauty, it's full of music and tranquility. And so this poem is in part romantic because it does not only celebrate the healing powers of the natural world, but also celebrates the extraordinary in the most ordinary of objects, the most ordinary of scenes. I ask you also to consider the title, To Whom is Bryant Writing? Well, he's writing for us, isn't he? Because he knows that just by virtue of being human, we become burdened with our concerns, with those things that occupy our hearts and our minds, our jobs, our school, our family, our health. And if you dwell in that realm for too long without getting a taste of nature, you can get very downhearted and depressed. And so this poem is a poem that says, hey, when you begin feeling that way, you should go to nature, go to the woods. And so this poem is really well, as the title suggests, he's saying that this is a poem that would be good to put right at the entrance uh, to almost every wood that we go into, every state park. If you like to go hiking, think about going up to Montesano and hiking, or out to the Wheeler Refuge. Right? We go there because it restores us and brings peace to us. We're able to leave the burdens, the concerns, the shame, the guilt of life behind us. That's why it's called recreation, because the natural world literally recreates us, has the ability to, I think. William Cullen Bryant's poem, To a Waterfowl. Well, let's begin by answering the question that you might have. What is a waterfowl? A waterfowl is any bird that is associated with water, so aquatic birds such as ducks, geese, etc. So here's a poem to a waterfowl. What's up with that? What's going on? Okay, I'm going to ask you to read along in your book as I read the poem. Couldn't really find a good one out there, and why would you want to hear anybody else but me read it? To a waterfowl. Whither midst falling dew, while glow the heavens with the last steps of day, far through their rosy depth dost thou pursue thy solitary way? Vainly the fowler's eye might mark thy distant flight to do thee wrong, as darkly seen against the crimson sky thy figure floats along. Seekest thou the plashy brink of weedy lake, or marge of river wide, or where the rocking billows rise and sink on the chafed ocean side? There is a power whose care teaches thy way along that pathless coast, the desert and illimitable air, lone wandering, but not lost. All day thy wings have fanned at that far height the cold, thin atmosphere, yet stoop not weary to the welcome land, though the dark night is near. And soon that toil shall end. Soon shalt thou find a summer home and rest, and scream among thy fellows. Reeds shall bend soon over thy sheltered nest. Thou art gone. The abyss of heaven hath swallowed up thy form, yet on my heart deeply hath sunk the lesson thou hast given, and shall not soon depart. He who from zone to zone guides through the boundless sky thy certain flight, in the long way that I must trace alone, will lead my steps aright. All right, so let's look at this poem. Structurally, what would we say about it? Look at it on the page. It looks pretty regular, doesn't it? Right? We have a poem that has very clear stanzas, right? Very clear breaking points or resting points in between them. Each stanza is made up of how many lines? 4 lines. A 4-line stanza is called a quatrain. Do you remember that? Look at the rhyme scheme. You can see how do rhymes with pursue, day rhymes with way in the first stanza. So it's an alternating rhyme scheme, isn't it? A, B, A, B, and this is sustained through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stanzas, correct? So the poem is very conventional, very traditional, very neoclassical, right? There's nothing very bold or experimental about this poem. Again, back to that earlier slide about Bryant's critics. This is what they would criticize him about, is they're saying that he's not being bold enough or original enough in his versification. So let's look at the second question. How would we paraphrase this poem? What would Marvin Gaye say when he asks us what's going on in this poem? Well, there's a speaker. He's outside, right? Let's start with the most basic things. He's outside. He's walking in the natural world. He sees a waterfowl flying up in the sky, right? And he notes it, and he begins questioning it and wondering about it. Like, what the heck are you doing up there, Mr. Bird? You're up there, you're all alone, and you're flapping those wings. In the second stanza, he says, hey, a hunter might look at you and say, hey, I could probably shoot that bird right out of the sky, right? The hunter would mark thy distant flight to do thee wrong. In the third stanza, he's questioning, where's this bird going? Where are you headed? Because you seem to be flapping those wings like you know exactly where you're going. But look in the fourth stanza. He says, there is a power that teaches the way along the pathless coast, right? There are no signs or directions or markers up there in the sky that say you're heading north or you're heading south, right? These migratory aquatic birds like geese, right, that go north and south as the season uh, uh, dictates. So there's a power that does this. that guides thee along this pathless coast. The waterfowl is lone wandering. It's solitary. It's by itself. But notice this, it's not lost, right? It knows where it's going. In the next two stanzas, the speaker is describing and remarking about the effort and the work that the waterfowl seems to be demonstrating and exerting, right? And conjectures or begins to speculate about that one day that bird is going to stop flying and come land, right? And soon your toil will end and you will find that place that you're looking for, right? You'll find that summer home and you're going to hang out with all your bird friends, right? And squawk up a storm. Excuse me. Look at the last two stanza. The bird now has flown beyond the speaker's vision or view. The bird has gone, and all that's left are the heavens. The heavens have swallowed up thy form. Yet, the speaker says, on my heart deeply hath sunk the lesson that thou hast given. And I'm not going to soon forget it, right? That's what he's saying there in that second to last stanza. And this is the human truth, I think, that's revealed through this poem. It comes in the last stanza. He's been building toward this cumulative theme here by giving us this little drama that we've witnessed between the speaker and the waterfowl that he's been observing. Here's the last stanza. He, capitalized he, right? And you might refer to that earlier stanza, there is a power. I think that power is being evoked here again in the last stanza. He, in other words, God, the creator. He who from zone to zone, in other words, wherever you have been traveling, he guides you through the boundless sky. He that guides you through the boundless sky, your certain flight. In the long way that I must trace alone, will lead my steps aright. You see what William Cullen Bryant does there in the last two lines? I hope you do, because what he's saying is that the very same power, that same instinctual power that is guiding the natural world, that's guiding this migratory aquatic waterfowl, it's the very same power and the same care, the same force, the same universal force that's driving that bird to its ultimate destination. Is the very same power, the very same force that will guide the speaker, right, through his own life journey. Even though that speaker might seem at this present time to be alone, maybe a little scared, maybe a little unsure about the path that his life will take. And I mean, aren't we all that way at some point in our lives, where we wonder, how's this thing turn out, right? And so William Cullen Bryant saying, don't worry about that, right? Because as just as that waterfowl, the same force, the same power that guides that bird through its destination, through its course to its ultimate destination, is that same loving, powerful force that's going to help each of us make our own way and will help lead our steps right. Let me tell you what, William Cullen Bryant could do it. Damn good poet. I hope you like this poem. It's one of my favorites. I hope you guys have a good day. I'm thinking about you a lot and I miss you.